Before we move on to our TCA cycle, I know I said that our acetyl-CoA will enter into the TCA cycle, and we will look at the TCA cycle. But before I get into that, I want to show you guys where our other nutrients come into play. Because so far, all that we have seen is carbohydrates. Because we started off with glycolysis, glucose to pyruvate, and we know that glucose comes from our carbohydrates. So the pathways that we've looked at so far has only really been for the carbohydrates. We haven't seen how our proteins or fats would enter metabolism, and they also produce energy, so we do need to see how they would enter metabolism and be used to make energy. So let's start off with looking at our proteins. Proteins are made of amino acids, and amino acids can either be glucogenic or ketogenic. What glucogenic means, glucose stands for glucose, genic stands for the creation of. So literally what it means is the creation of glucose. So amino acids that are glucogenic can be used to generate glucose. And if we follow the arrows, you'll be able to see how. So we have some amino acids that can enter metabolism by being converted into our pyruvate structure. Now, this step from glucose to pyruvate is actually reversible. And because it's reversible, this is going to be very important because it's going to allow some of our nutrients to be able to convert back into glucose. And that's exactly what's happening here. Since these amino acids are going to be converted into pyruvate, and pyruvate can reverse back into glucose, that means these amino acids can technically be used to make glucose. This is going to be beneficial in the situations where maybe your body doesn't have enough glucose and it needs it to use for fuel, and so it's going to have to make its own glucose. One of the ways that we can achieve this is through this pathway over here, using these glucogenic amino acids. Now, some of our amino acids cannot be used to make glucose, and these are going to be called ketogenic, meaning that they will make something called ketones instead, and we'll learn a little bit more about exactly what that means and how that's done later on in this chapter. But for now, let's go ahead and take a look at where these amino acids enter and why is it that they're not able to make glucose. So these set of amino acids enter into the metabolism pathway by being converted into the acetyl-CoA structure. If you take a look, acetyl-CoA is not reversible back into pyruvate. And the way that we would get to glucose is by going to pyruvate and reversing back up into glucose. Since the step from acetyl-CoA to pyruvate is not reversible, that is not possible. With the first set of amino acids, we entered where these steps were still reversible and we could go up to glucose. But acetyl-CoA is not reversible. So what that tells us is once we've reached acetyl-CoA, we can't reverse back up into glucose, which means that these amino acids are not glucogenic. They are not able to make glucose. Now we also have a third entryway that's not shown on here for you because it actually happens later in the pathway. So we're going to go ahead and move on to another picture that shows us that third entryway of our amino acids. Now, this here shows us all three entryways. Again, these are still amino acids. They've just drawn them out for you now. So this was our first set of glucogenic amino acids that we said entered the pathway by converting into pyruvate. This is our second set of amino acids that we said entered by converting into acetyl-CoA. And the third set of amino acids that was not shown on the previous picture were these down here. And these amino acids are going to enter straight into the TCA cycle. Now, these that enter into the TCA cycle are actually glucogenic as well. And we'll learn a little bit why that is later on in this chapter. But for now, what I want you guys to know are the three different entryways for amino acids and which ones are glucogenic, which ones are not, and what that means. So the first set enters into pyruvate, and that is glucogenic, meaning it can be used to make glucose. The second set of amino acids will enter by being converted into acetyl-CoA. That cannot reverse back up, so it cannot be used to make glucose. The third set of amino acids is glucogenic, and it is going to enter directly into the TCA cycle. Alright, so that covers the protein part of our metabolism pathway. Now we can go ahead and look at how our fats are going to enter into the pathway. Now remember, we're talking about how we get energy from the nutrients in our diet. And if you remember from our fats chapter, we said that the fat that is typically found in our diet is in triglyceride form. Triglyceride is our main dietary fat, or the type of fat that is usually found in our foods. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And if you remember, triglycerides are made of a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acids. So when we look at how our fats enter into metabolism, we're going to be looking at those two components, the glycerol and the fatty acids, because those are what are found in our triglycerides, and triglycerides are the type of fat that we have in our diet. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this would happen. So we said that we were going to look at glycerol and fatty acids because those are the components of our triglyceride, or the type of fat in our diet. So let's start off looking at glycerol. Glycerol enters metabolism right before pyruvate. So remember, we broke glucose into 2 3-carbon compounds, and then they were converted into pyruvate. So that step before they convert into pyruvate, that's where glycerol enters. Now, if you pay attention to this, glycerol is entering where the step is still reversible. So technically what that means is glycerol can be used to make glucose as well. But if we look at our fatty acids enter the metabolism pathway by being converted into acetyl-CoA. Now, that is something that is not going to be able to reverse. Remember, we said once we reach acetyl-CoA, this step is not reversible, and that means once we are at acetyl-CoA, we cannot be used to make glucose. So technically, these fatty acids, since they are being converted into acetyl-CoA, they cannot be used to make glucose. Now, another thing that I want you guys to pay attention to is the fact that this step right here is reversible. And what that means is fatty acids will be able to enter by being turned into acetyl-CoA, but acetyl-CoA can also be used to make fatty acids. This is important because we've discussed before that anytime we eat in excess, our excess is going to be turned into fat, whether it started off as carbohydrates or protein. When we eat too much of those, they'll be turned into fat. And this here shows us why that is. Remember that we were able to make acetyl-CoA out of our carbohydrates, we were able to make acetyl-CoA out of our protein, and now we've seen that acetyl-CoA can be turned into fat. So again, what that tells us is anything that can be made into acetyl-CoA can then be turned into fat. Since our carbohydrates and protein can make acetyl-CoA, technically they can be turned into fat as well. But let's go ahead and take a look at how these fats are entering in a little bit more detail. So over here, we are looking at the structure just drawn out a little bit more for us. So this was our glycerol, and it entered in between glucose and pyruvate. And this is an example of one of the fatty acids that could have been present. Now, if you remember from our fats chapter, fatty acids have a bunch of carbons attached to them. And if you remember what the acetyl-CoA structure looks like, we have it right here. Acetyl-CoA is made out of 2 carbons attached to coenzyme A. Since fatty acids have a bunch of carbons in them, that means that they can make a lot of acetyl-CoA. All we have to do is break off 2 carbons at a time, attach coenzyme A, and now we have made 1 acetyl-CoA. Then we'll take the other 2 carbons, attach coenzyme A, we've made another acetyl-CoA. And we're just going to keep doing that until we've used up all of the carbons in our fatty acid chain. Now, this fatty acid had 16 carbons, and as you can see, we ended up making 8 acetyl-CoA from that. Because remember, each acetyl-CoA is going to use 2 carbons. If we break off 2 carbons at a time, and we had 16, we end up with 8 acetyl-CoA. So we can actually make a bunch of energy just from one fatty acid for this reason. Now, another thing that I want to point out is we are still releasing hydrogens and electrons. This has been happening in all of our steps. Anytime we broke something off, there were still hydrogens and electrons being released. You might have noticed that on the previous slides where I didn't mention it, but you saw that it said coenzymes right there. This is just reminding us that anytime we break something off, we're releasing hydrogens and electrons, and the coenzymes are picking them up. So same thing goes here. Every time we break off these 2 carbons, we release hydrogens and electrons, and the coenzymes are there collecting them. When we break off our next 2 carbons, the same thing happens. So just keep that in mind so that we can, again, build on that in a minute when we reach our electron transport chain, or the cashier where they will be cashed out. Now this here is showing us the process in just a little more detail. So we are looking at a fatty acid chain, and we know that acetyl-CoA is made out of 2 carbons with coenzyme A attached. So we are breaking off 2 carbons, adding coenzyme A. Now we have 1 acetyl-CoA, and the fatty acid chain is shorter. We can break off another 2 carbons, attach another coenzyme A. Now we've made our second acetyl-CoA, and the chain is even shorter. And we're just going to keep doing that until we have completely broken off or used up all of the carbons in our fatty acid. Now going back to this diagram over here, this is just a recap to remind us of what we've covered so far. And what I want you guys to notice from this is that the meeting place for all of our nutrients was acetyl-CoA. So whether we started off with carbohydrates or protein or fat, they all ended up making acetyl-CoA. So at this point, we have a bunch of acetyl-CoA that we've made. Some of it came from protein, some from carbs, some from fat, but it's all in the form of acetyl-CoA now. And so we can go ahead and take this acetyl-CoA into our next step, which is the TCA cycle.